Okay, so you know that feeling when, like, everyone's holding their breath, like the whole country,
Yeah.
waiting for something big to happen.
Yeah.
It's kind of where we are now, just a week away from this election.
Right.
And I don't know about you, but the political noise,
Yeah.
it's deafening.
Oh,
We're getting bombarded with these messages about what to fear,
it's definitely ramped up.
who to trust,
Mm-hmm.
and why everything is about to fall apart if we vote for the wrong person. So today, we're going to do a deep dive into all of that pre-election chaos.
Okay.
We're going to try to sift through a fiery speech from one of the candidates and a commentary from a pretty well-known political analyst.
Interesting.
And we're going to try to figure out what's really going on here.
Yeah, I mean, that feeling you described, it's practically built into election season at this point.
Yeah?
This last week is always a sprint to the finish line, you know?
Yeah,
And the messages, they just get cranked up to 11.
that's true.
It's all about grabbing your attention, making you feel something, and ultimately, you know, getting you to vote a certain way.
So how about we start unpacking this with Laura Ingram's take? She's definitely not pulling any punches in her analysis of the current political climate.
No, not at all. She's using some pretty strong language, actually, arguing that the opponent's whole campaign, the basis of it, is rage and hate.
Wow.
Now, why is she choosing those words?
Right.
I mean, it's not just about reporting on the opponent's ideas, it's about painting a picture.
Yeah.
A very specific picture of them for the voters.
Right.
Makes you wonder, what kind of effect is she aiming for here? Right.
Makes you wonder if she's trying to make voters afraid of the opponent, to make them see this election as a choice between, stability and utter chaos.
Exactly. And she takes it a step further. She brings up this anecdote about Democrats allegedly trying to keep Trump off the ballot in previous elections. Which plays right into this narrative she's building, right? About the opponent's supposed disregard for democracy, framing this whole thing as a fight for the soul of America.
But it's not all doom and gloom with Ingraham. She also spends quite a bit of time highlighting what she sees as Trump's strengths, trying to present him as the steady hand in this storm.
Right, absolutely. She focuses on his economic record, his border policies, foreign policy achievements.
Okay.
Essentially saying, look, this guy, he's got the experience, he's delivered results.
Yeah.
It's a classic incumbent strategy, right?
Right. Yeah.
Reminding voters what they might lose if they opt for change.
And then there's that fascinating contrast she draws between how the candidates try to connect with everyday people.
Oh, yeah. She brings up Trump's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Oh, right.
And that whole McDonald's drive-through moment, as examples of how, look, he's just a regular guy.
Yeah.
And then she juxtaposes that with what she sees as the opponent's rather forced attempts to come across as relatable.
Right.
Suggesting it's all just an act.
It's like she's saying you can't fake authenticity. But you have to admit, it's a pretty interesting tactic to use those very specific moments from Trump's life to build up this image of him.
Yeah. It definitely raises questions about how we perceive authenticity in politicians these days, especially in this age of carefully curated social media personas. It makes you think, what does genuine connection look like in politics?
That's a great question. Well, and speaking of connection, or maybe lack thereof, Ingram then dives into this whole issue of gender dynamics and how they might be playing out in this election, especially when it comes to male voters.
Right. She zeroes in on this political ad that seems to be encouraging women to lie to their husbands about their voting intentions.
Oh, wow.
And she really goes after it. She and former NASCAR driver Danica Patrick both come out swinging against it, arguing that it portrays men in a really negative light and could even be contributing to that gender gap we see in voting patterns.
But then you have J.D. Vance coming in with a totally different perspective, saying that women are perfectly capable of making their own decisions.
Yeah.
Without fear of any backlash.
Yeah, it's a really important counterpoint because it highlights how differently people view this issue. Vance's argument is all about trusting women, respecting their autonomy, and not resorting to manipulation or fear tactics.
Yeah. So we've got two very different approaches here.
Absolutely.
It's like they're both trying to appeal to women voters, but with vastly different messages.
Right. And it makes you wonder, what resonates more with voters in the end? Is it the message of empowerment or the message of playing it safe?
So we've got this backdrop of fear and anxiety that Ingram's painting. And then, almost like she's providing evidence for that anxiety, she shifts gears to immigration and security, which always seems to be front and center in these elections. And she really leans into the fear factor here. She and Senator Katie Britt make a direct link between the opponent's immigration policies and what they see as a spike in crime, especially crimes against women and girls.
Right.
It's a very targeted message, playing on those very deep-seated fears about safety and security.
Absolutely.
And they don't shy away from using some really disturbing examples to drive that point home, do they?
Not at all. They bring up an attempted rape that was caught on video and the absolutely tragic case of a 12-year-old girl who was murdered.
Yeah, these are real stories, horrific stories,
Yeah.
and they're using them to create a very visceral reaction in the audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want voters to feel that fear, that sense of vulnerability,
Exactly.
and to make them question, is the opponent's approach really keeping us safe?
Right. They then go on to contrast their focus on these tangible consequences with the opponent's talk about seizing cartel assets,
Right.
which they frame as a much less effective solution.
Yeah, so in a way, they're almost saying, vote for us if you want to feel safe.
Right. It's about creating a sense of urgency, a sense that the threat is real and immediate.
Now, after really delving into immigration, Ingram turns her attention to a couple of congressional races that she believes could have a significant impact on the overall election outcome.
Interesting.
She highlights one in Virginia and one in Michigan,
Okay.
suggesting that they're microcosms of this larger political battle playing out across the country. It's like she's saying, pay attention to these races. They're a preview of what's at stake.
Yeah.
So let's start with Virginia. It sounds like there's a stark contrast between the two candidates vying for that seat.
There is. On the one hand, the Democrat is running a campaign focused on abortion rights, maintaining funding for Ukraine. And on the other side, you have a Republican candidate, a Green Beret veteran who's making the economy and border security his top priorities.
It's almost like a microcosm of the national political divide, right?
It really is.
And then in Michigan, it sounds like the Republican candidate is facing that age-old challenge of trying to connect with the younger generation of voters.
Exactly. And it's a tough demographic to win over, especially for candidates who might be seen as representing the establishment. You have to find ways to speak to their concerns, their anxieties, their vision for the future.
It makes you wonder, what kind of strategies might actually resonate with those younger voters who are often pretty disillusioned with traditional politics.
Yeah, it's a question that a lot of campaigns are grappling with right now. And the answers are not always clear-cut.
So while Ingram is really laser-focused on these congressional races, we also have the other candidate making their closing arguments in this big speech.
Okay.
And it sounds like they're going all in on portraying the opponent as a threat to democracy itself. They're really not holding back, are they?
So how are they doing that?
Well, they're invoking the imagery of January 6th. Using really strong language to suggest that the opponent is willing to undermine the very foundations of our democracy. It's a powerful and potentially polarizing tactic.
I bet.
And to really hammer that point home, they use some very specific lines from the opponent's past statements and actions, painting this picture of someone who's power-hungry and dangerous. It's a classic strategy, cherry-picking moments and sound bites to fit a very specific narrative.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of this is based on reality and how much of it is strategic exaggeration.
Yeah. It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely makes you think about how easily information can be manipulated, especially in the heat of an election.
Well, that's a lot to digest.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from these candidates' key messages to the anxieties that are shaping this election.
Right.
I think it's worth pausing for a moment and reflecting on what we've heard so far. What stands out to you? What are your initial reactions to these very contrasting approaches?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? We're seeing such a clear divide in how these candidates are trying to connect with voters.
Yeah.
One is leaning heavily on fear and anxiety,
Yeah.
playing on those primal instincts, right, to create a sense of urgency, of danger.
Right. It's almost like they're saying, choose us or chaos reigns.
Exactly. But then the other candidate is trying to tap into something different, something that feels more hopeful, more aspirational.
Yeah, although they are framing the opponent as a threat, it's not so much about personal safety as it is about the integrity of our institutions,
Right.
about
Yep.
upholding those democratic principles.
It's a different kind of fear, maybe, a fear of losing something bigger than ourselves, something that defines who we are as a nation.
It's interesting, though, how both sides are ultimately tapping into that same underlying anxiety
That's right.
that seems to be permeating everything right now.
Yeah, that sense of uncertainty, that feeling that things are changing too fast, that we're losing control. It's definitely a common thread running through both of these campaigns.
And it makes you wonder, how effective are these different approaches, especially in such a polarized climate?
Yeah.
what resonates more with voters?
Because ultimately, it comes down to how voters perceive these messages, right? What sticks with them? What influences their decision in that voting booth?
Yeah, and that's what makes this final week so crucial, right?
Exactly.
It's about shaping perceptions, solidifying allegiances, and ultimately mobilizing voters to take action.
So, if we step back and look at the bigger picture here, what does all of this tell us about the state of our political landscape?
It feels like we're seeing the culmination of years of polarization and mistrust,
Yeah.
all boiling over in these last few days before the election. It's like a pressure cooker that's about to explode.
What's fascinating is how these final week messages reflect those deeper divisions and anxieties within the electorate.
Yeah.
It's like a mirror held up to society,
Right.
revealing those fault lines, the issues that are truly driving this election.
It's not just about the specific policies or even the candidates themselves. It's about this fundamental clash of worldviews,
Right.
a clash of how we see the country and its future.
And that makes it incredibly challenging for voters to navigate this information landscape, to make informed decisions, especially when they're being bombarded with such emotionally charged rhetoric.
Which raises the question,
Yeah.
how do we, as citizens, cut through all the noise and make choices based on facts rather than fear? How do we resist being manipulated by these highly crafted messages?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I
Yeah.
think a big part of it comes down to critical thinking, to really examining the claims being made and the evidence being presented.
And being aware of our own biases,
And-
right? Recognizing how our own fears and anxieties can influence how we interpret information.
Exactly. It's about taking a step back, asking ourselves, what am I really seeing here? What's the evidence? And am I letting my emotions cloud my judgment?
It's almost like we need a voter's toolkit for navigating this political minefield, something that helps us identify those manipulation tactics and empowers us to make informed choices.
That's a great idea. And it's something we can all work towards, right?
Yeah.
By becoming more conscious consumers of information. We can resist those divisive forces and contribute to a more informed and reasoned public discourse.
Because at the end of the day, that's what democracy is all about, right?
Absolutely.
Making informed choices based on a shared understanding of the facts.
It's about engaging in a meaningful dialogue, even when we disagree,
Yeah.
and finding that common ground where we can.
It sounds idealistic, but in a climate like this, it feels more crucial than ever.
It does, and perhaps that's the challenge we all face. How do we hold on to that idealism, that belief in the power of informed discourse in the face of such divisive rhetoric?
It's a tough question, but it's one worth grappling with, especially as we head into this final week and prepare to cast our votes.
Absolutely. And it's a question that'll likely stay with us long after the election is over.
So we've got these big picture anxieties, the national debates, these contrasting campaign styles. But now I want to dive into something a little more specific, something that both candidates are using masterfully in their final push to win over voters.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean?
I'm talking about storytelling.
Ah, okay. Got it.
Because stories, they have this incredible power to connect with us on a gut level,
Yeah.
to move us emotionally, and to influence how we see the world.
Right. They can be incredibly persuasive, especially when they tap into our deepest fears and hopes.
And both candidates are weaving narratives that do just that.
Okay.
They're creating these compelling characters, painting vivid pictures of what's at stake in this election, and ultimately trying to persuade us that their vision for the future is the one worth fighting for.
Interesting. So let's start by unpacking how Laura Ingraham uses storytelling in her analysis. She paints a very specific picture of the kind of America she believes the opponent would create.
And it's not a pretty picture, is it?
No, not at all. She focuses on themes of chaos and lawlessness, highlighting incidents of violence and crime that she directly links to the opponent's policies. It's like she's painting a dystopian future, where our safety and security are constantly under threat.
And she uses some really powerful imagery, right?
Oh, yeah.
She talks about open borders, unchecked immigration, a weakening of law enforcement, all of it contributing to this sense of societal breakdown.
Yeah.
You know, it's a story that resonates with a certain segment of the population who feel like the country is slipping away from them, that their values are under attack, and that their way of life is disappearing. They see the opponent as a symbol of that decline.
Right.
someone who doesn't share their values or understand their concerns.
And in contrast, she presents Trump as a figure of strength and stability, someone who can restore order and bring back those traditional values.
Right.
She highlights his accomplishments on the economy, border security, foreign policy, painting a picture of a strong leader who gets things done.
Yeah.
It's like she's saying he's the only one who can fix this mess.
It's a very clear narrative, a story of decline and redemption,
Yeah.
with Trump as this hero who can save America from itself.
And it's a story that's proven to be incredibly effective in the past, especially when it comes to mobilizing certain voters.
Now let's look at the other candidate's speech and see how they're using storytelling to try and persuade voters. It seems like their focus is less on painting this dystopian future and more on highlighting the threat to democratic principles and institutions.
Right. They're not just saying things are bad. They're saying the very foundation of our democracy is at risk.
Yeah, they invoke this imagery of January 6th, casting the opponent as someone who's willing to undermine the very systems that guarantee our freedoms. And they use some really strong language, accusing the opponent of being like a danger to the country, someone who cannot be trusted with power.
They also tell stories, though. But their stories are more focused on individuals who have been marginalized or harmed by the opponent's policies. They talk about immigrants who have been separated from their families, women who have been denied access to health care, minorities who have been targeted by hate crimes.
So it's still a story about the erosion of our values, but from a very different perspective.
Absolutely.
It's about the threat to inclusivity, tolerance, equal rights.
And it's designed to resonate with voters who are concerned about the direction the country's headed in terms of social justice and civil liberties.
Right. So we're seeing two very different narratives being woven here, both designed to tap into our deepest fears and hopes.
Right.
But I think what's important to remember is that these are just stories. They're carefully constructed narratives designed to persuade us.
That's right.
It's our job as informed citizens to critically examine these stories, to look beyond those emotional appeals and assess the evidence being presented.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, our decisions shouldn't be based on fear or anger, but on a clear understanding of the facts and the potential consequences of our choices.
It's a challenge, especially in this hyper-polarized climate, but it's one that we must rise to if we want to preserve the integrity of our democracy.
And it starts with recognizing the power of storytelling, understanding how it can be used to manipulate and persuade, and developing the critical thinking skills necessary to discern fact from fiction.
Because these stories, while compelling, don't always reflect the full reality of the situation.
Right.
They're often simplified versions of these complex issues, designed to elicit a very specific emotional response. And it's our responsibility to dig deeper, to ask questions, to seek out multiple perspectives, because only then can we truly make informed choices that reflect our values and contribute to a more just and equitable society.
Now, you mentioned earlier how both campaigns are tapping into this underlying anxiety that's permeating everything right now. I think that's a crucial point to unpack a bit further.
Okay, yeah, it's like there's this undercurrent of fear and uncertainty running through everything, and both candidates are trying to channel that energy in different ways.
One is trying to make us afraid of what the other side will do, playing on those fears about crime, immigration, the erosion of traditional values. And the other is trying to make us afraid of losing those democratic principles, those institutions that we hold dear.
That's right.
But the question is, where does all this anxiety come from? What's fueling it?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors, right?
Yeah.
We've got the pandemic, economic uncertainty, political polarization, social unrest, climate change.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's like a perfect storm of anxiety-inducing events.
Yeah, it's true. And with all of that happening at once, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel like things are spinning out of control.
Absolutely. And that's where these campaigns come in, right?
Right.
Offering themselves as the solution, the antidote to that anxiety.
The question is, are they actually offering real solutions? Or are they just exploiting those fears for their own gain?
It's a tough question, and one that each of us needs to answer for ourselves, I think, as we evaluate these messages and make our choices.
Because the reality is, these anxieties, they're real. People are worried, people are struggling.
That's right.
And it's those anxieties that are shaping this election more than anything else.
Which brings us to another really powerful force at play in this election: identity politics.
Right. It seems like identity has become this central battleground in our political discourse, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We see it in the way candidates appeal to specific demographic groups,
Mm-hmm.
highlighting issues that resonate with their particular experiences and values. And it's not just about demographics like race, gender, religion.
Yeah.
It's also about those broader cultural identities.
Yeah, like rural versus urban,
Yeah.
conservative versus liberal, even those who identify as patriots versus those labeled as globalists.
Exactly. It's like we're witnessing a fragmentation of our national identity with
Mhm.
people retreating into these smaller, more insular groups.
And that fragmentation is being exploited by politicians
Mm-hmm.
who are seeking to divide us for their own gain.
Right.
They're playing on our fears and anxieties, pitting us against each other, and making it harder and harder to find common ground.
It's a dangerous game,
It is.
one that threatens the very fabric of our democracy.
So how do we navigate this landscape of identity politics?
Yeah.
How do we resist being divided and manipulated?
Well, first, I think we have to recognize that our identities are complex and multifaceted. We're not just one thing, right?
Right.
We all belong to multiple groups, and those memberships overlap and intersect in ways that defy simple categorization.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that our shared humanity transcends these differences.
Absolutely.
You know, we all have the same basic needs and aspirations, regardless of our race, gender, political beliefs.
It's those shared values that should bind us together, not tear us apart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we move beyond this divisive rhetoric of identity politics and find that common ground?
Well, it starts with listening to each other, right? With trying to understand where the other side is coming from. It's about having empathy. Recognizing that people's experiences and perspectives are shaped by their own unique journeys. And it's about finding ways to bridge that gap between us,
Right.
to build relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. It's not easy, especially in a climate where trust is so low and divisions run so deep, but
It's a true
it's essential. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we want to create a more just and equitable society, one where everyone feels seen and valued.
So as we head into this final week, let's be mindful of the language we use and the stories we tell.
Right.
Let's challenge ourselves to see beyond the labels and stereotypes that divide us.
Mm-hmm.
And remember that our shared humanity is far more powerful than any differences that might separate us.
It's a message worth holding on to, not just during this election season, but in all aspects of our lives.
Yeah.
It's a message that reminds us that we're all in this together.
And that our collective future depends on our ability to find common ground and build bridges across our differences.
Now, let's talk about the role of media in shaping our perceptions of this election.
Okay.
Because it's not just the candidates who are telling stories, right?
Excellent.
The media plays a huge role in framing the narrative,
Yeah.
in highlighting certain events, amplifying certain voices, and ultimately influencing how we interpret what's happening.
And with the rise of social media, it's become even harder to discern fact from fiction,
Right.
to know who to trust, and to get a balanced perspective on the issues.
Yeah, it's like we're all trapped in our own echo chambers,
Yeah.
surrounded by information that just confirms our existing beliefs and biases.
Right. And that makes it so easy to fall prey to misinformation, propaganda, those emotionally charged narratives that are designed to manipulate us.
Absolutely.
So what can we do to navigate this complex media landscape and make sure we're getting accurate and balanced information?
Well, I think it starts with being aware of our own biases.
Yeah.
Recognizing that we all have these preconceived notions, and those can really influence how we interpret information.
Yeah. And being willing to seek out diverse perspectives.
Right.
Not just listening to the voices that confirm what we already believe.
And being critical thinkers.
Mhm.
Questioning the information that we're presented with, looking for evidence to support the claims being made.
And being wary of those emotionally charged headlines and sound bites
Right.
that are designed to grab our attention,
Yeah.
but often lack context or nuance.
Because the reality is, these complex issues rarely have simple solutions.
It's true.
And it's our responsibility to dig deeper, to go beyond those surface-level narratives,
Yeah.
and to engage in these thoughtful, informed discussions about the challenges facing our country.
Yeah.
Because that's what democracy demands of us.
And that's what our future depends on.
Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the issue that seems to be driving a lot of the anxiety and division in this election.
You're talking about the economy, right?
Exactly. It's the issue that touches every aspect of our lives, right? And it's the issue that both candidates are using to try and win over voters.
One is painting this picture of economic prosperity under their leadership,
Right.
pointing to job growth, stock market gains, low unemployment rates, and the other is arguing that those gains haven't benefited everyone, that the gap between the rich and poor is widening, and that many people are struggling to make ends meet.
Absolutely.
They're pointing to rising inflation, stagnant wages, and the increasing cost of healthcare and education as evidence that the system is rigged against working families.
Right. And both sides are offering solutions, of course.
Right.
Tax cuts, government spending, deregulation, job training programs.
It's on and on.
The list goes on and on. But the question is, which approach is more likely to address the root causes of our economic anxieties? And which approach is more likely to create a more just and equitable society?
Yeah, those are the questions that voters will be grappling with as they head to the polls.
And those are the questions that will determine the course of our nation's economic future.
So let's dive into some of this specific economic policies that are being debated in this election
Okay.
and try to unpack what they mean for everyday Americans.
Good idea. Let's start with taxes. One of the biggest dividing lines between the candidates is their approach to taxation.
One candidate's proposing significant tax cuts,
Okay.
particularly for corporations and wealthy individuals, arguing that this will stimulate economic growth and create jobs.
Right. And the other is advocating for tax increases on the wealthy, arguing that this is necessary to fund social programs, reduce inequality, and invest in infrastructure.
It's a classic debate between those who believe that tax cuts trickle down to the rest of the economy and those who believe that government spending is necessary to create a safety net and invest in public goods.
Yeah, and there's no easy answer, of course.
It's true.
Both sides have valid points, and the best approach likely lies somewhere in the middle. But the important thing is that we have an informed and nuanced debate about these issues, rather than simply resorting to partisan talking points.
Because the decisions we make about taxes, they have a profound impact on our economy, our society, our future.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to another really contentious issue, healthcare.
One candidate is advocating for a market-based approach to healthcare, arguing that competition will drive down costs and increase quality, and the other is pushing for a more government-run system, arguing that healthcare is a right, not a privilege,
Right.
and that everyone should have access to affordable, high-quality care.
It's a debate that's been raging for decades, and it's one that reflects our deeply held beliefs about the role of government, the nature of individual responsibility, and the value that we place on human life. And it's a debate that has very real consequences for millions of Americans who are struggling to afford health care, who are facing sky-high deductibles, and who are worried about going bankrupt if they get sick.
So as we evaluate these candidates' healthcare proposals, it's important to ask ourselves, what kind of healthcare system do we want to create? And what values do we want that system to reflect?
These are not easy questions, but they're questions that we must grapple with if we want to build a healthier and more equitable society.
Now let's shift our focus to another issue that's been front and center in this election,
Okay.
education.
Huh.
One candidate is advocating for school choice, arguing that parents should have more control over their children's education, and that competition will improve the quality of our schools. And the other is calling for increased funding for public education, arguing that we need to invest in our teachers, reduce class sizes, and provide equal opportunities for all students.
It's a debate that reflects our deeply held beliefs about the purpose of education, the role of government, the value we place on equality. And it's a debate that has very real consequences for millions of children across the country who are facing overcrowded classrooms, inadequate resources, and a growing achievement gap.
So as we evaluate these candidates' education proposals, it's important to ask ourselves, what kind of education system do we want to create? And what values do we want that system to reflect?
These are not easy questions, but they're questions that we must grapple with if we want to ensure that all children have the opportunity to reach their full potential. Now, let's turn our attention to another issue that's been generating a lot of heat in this election: climate change.
One candidate is very skeptical of the science of climate change, arguing that the government should not intervene in the free market, address it. And the other is advocating for bold action to reduce carbon emissions, invest in renewable energy, and transition to a more sustainable economy.
It's a debate that reflects our deeply held beliefs about the role of science, the limits of government intervention, and our responsibility to future generations. And it's a debate that has real consequences for the planet, for our economy, and for the future of humanity.
Right.
So as we evaluate these candidates' climate change policies, it's important to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to leave for our children and grandchildren? And what are we willing to do to protect the planet? Those are not easy questions, but they're questions that we must grapple with if we want to ensure a sustainable and livable future for all.
Now, let's delve into another issue that's been a recurring theme in this election.
Okay.
Foreign policy.
Right?
One candidate is advocating for a more isolationist approach, arguing that we should focus on our own domestic problems and avoid getting entangled in foreign conflicts. And the other is calling for a more engaged and interventionist approach, arguing that we have a moral obligation to promote democracy and human rights around the world.
It's a debate that reflects our deeply held beliefs about America's role in the world, the limits of our power, and our responsibility to others. And it's a debate that has real consequences for our national security, our economy, and our standing in the world.
So as we evaluate these candidates' foreign policy proposals, it's important to ask ourselves, what role do we want America to play in the world? And what values do we want to guide our foreign policy decisions?
Those are not easy questions, but they're questions that we must grapple with if we want to ensure a peaceful and prosperous future for our nation and for the world.
Now let's talk about another issue that's been front and center in this election.
Okay.
Immigration.
Right.
One candidate is advocating for stricter border security, increased deportations, and a reduction in legal immigration, arguing that this is necessary to protect American jobs and security. And the other is calling for a more compassionate approach, including a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, arguing that immigrants contribute to our economy and enrich our society.
It's a debate that reflects our deeply held beliefs about the nature of American identity, the role of diversity, and our responsibility to those seeking a better life. And it's a debate that has real consequences for millions of immigrants and their families who are living in fear of deportation, who are struggling to access healthcare and education, and who are contributing to our economy and our communities.
So as we evaluate these candidates' immigration policies, it's important to ask ourselves, what kind of nation do we want to be? And what values do we want to guide our immigration policies?
These are not easy questions, but they're questions that we must grapple with if we want to build a more just and humane society.
Now let's turn our attention to another issue that's been a source of really intense debate in this election: social justice.
One candidate is appealing to traditional values, arguing that we need to uphold law and order, while the other is focusing on systemic racism and calling for police reform and criminal justice reform.
It's a debate that reflects our deeply held beliefs about equality, fairness, and the role of government in addressing social problems. And it's a debate that has real consequences for communities of color who are disproportionately impacted by police brutality, mass incarceration, and economic inequality.
Right.
So as we evaluate the candidates' social justice policies, it's important to ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want to live in? And what values do we want to uphold?
These are not easy questions, but they're questions that we must grapple with if we want to create a more just and equitable society for all.
Now let's dive into another issue that's been a flashpoint in this election.
Yeah.
Gun control.
One candidate's advocating for stricter gun control measures, including universal background checks and an assault weapons ban, arguing that this is necessary to reduce gun violence and save lives.
And the other is defending the Second Amendment, arguing that gun ownership is a fundamental right that should not be infringed upon.
It's a debate that reflects our deeply held beliefs about individual liberty, the role of government, and the balance between safety and freedom. And it's a debate that has very real consequences for communities across the country that are being ravaged by gun violence.
Right.
And for families who have lost loved ones to gun violence.
So as we evaluate these candidates' gun control policies, it's important to ask ourselves, what kind of nation do we want to be? And what values do we want to prioritize?
These are not easy questions, but they're questions that we must grapple with if we want to create a safer and more peaceful society.
Yeah, it feels like with every issue we unpack, we just uncover another layer of complexity.
That's the thing about elections. They force us to confront those complexities, to have those difficult conversations, and to make choices about the kind of future we want to build. And those choices, they're not always easy or straightforward.
It's like we're being asked to weigh these competing values, to balance individual rights against the common good,
Right.
and to make decisions with imperfect information.
And to do all of that while being bombarded with these messages that are designed to appeal to our emotions rather than our reason.
Yeah.
It's no wonder people are feeling anxious and overwhelmed.
So where do we go from here? How do we make sense of all this and cast a vote that aligns with our values and our vision for the future?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that there are no easy answers, no magic solutions.
And that anyone who claims to have all the answers is probably trying to sell you something.
Exactly. This election is not about finding the perfect candidate because that candidate doesn't exist.
Right.
It's about choosing the candidate whose vision for the future most closely aligns with our own, even if we don't agree with them on every single issue.
Right. It's about looking beyond the rhetoric, the fear-mongering, the empty promises, and trying to discern which candidate is offering a genuine path forward.
And it's about remembering that our democracy depends on our active and informed participation.
So let's not check out. Let's not give in to cynicism or despair.
Right.
Let's stay engaged, stay informed, and cast a vote that reflects our hopes for a better future.
Because even in these uncertain times, our voices matter, our choices have power, and our votes can make a difference.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways that you hope listeners will carry with them as they navigate these final days of this election?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they'll remember that this is not a spectator sport. We can't just sit on the sidelines and complain about the state of our politics. We have to get involved, make our voices heard, and hold our leaders accountable.
Right. And we have to do that in a way that's constructive,
Exactly.
that's grounded in facts and reason, and that seeks to bridge divides rather than widen them.
Exactly. Because the future of our democracy depends on our ability to engage in respectful and productive dialogue, even when we disagree.
I think another really important takeaway is that we need to be critical consumers of information.
Yes.
With so much misinformation and disinformation circulating, it's more important than ever to verify what we're seeing and hearing, to seek out multiple perspectives, and to be wary of those who traffic in fear and division.
And we need to be mindful of our own biases, recognizing that we all have them and that they can influence how we interpret information.
Absolutely. We need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions, to listen to perspectives that differ from our own, and to engage in respectful debate.
And finally, I hope listeners will come away from this deep dive with a renewed sense of hope and possibility.
Yeah.
Because even though our political system is far from perfect, and even though we face some really daunting challenges, we also have the power to create a better future. But it's going to take all of us working together to make that happen.
So let's get to work.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something we touched on earlier. The power of storytelling in shaping our perceptions of this election. Because it's not just the candidates who are telling stories, right? The media plays a huge role in framing the narrative, in deciding which stories get told and how they're told.
That's a great point. We're constantly bombarded with information from a variety of sources, news outlets, social media, political commentators, even our friends and family members. And each of those sources comes with its own biases, its own agenda, its own way of framing the issues.
And with the rise of social media, it's become even harder to discern fact from fiction, to know who to trust, and to get a balanced perspective on the issues.
It's like we're all living in our own echo chambers, surrounded by information that confirms our existing beliefs and biases.
Which makes it incredibly easy to fall prey to misinformation, propaganda, and those emotionally charged narratives that are designed to manipulate us.
So how do we navigate this complex media landscape and make sure we're getting accurate and balanced information?
Well, I think it starts with being aware of those biases, both our own and those of the sources we're consuming.
We need to ask ourselves, who's telling this story?
Right.
What's their agenda? What information are they choosing to highlight or downplay? And what are they trying to get me to believe or do?
Right. And we need to be willing to step outside of our comfort zones, to seek out information from a variety of sources and expose ourselves to different perspectives.
Yeah, and it's also important to be critical thinkers, right?
Yes.
To question what we're seeing and hearing and to look for evidence to support the claims being made.
Don't just take things at face value. Do your own research. Check your sources. And be wary of information that seems too good to be true or that confirms your biases a little too perfectly.
Yeah. It's also a good idea to be aware of the different ways that information can be manipulated. For example, be on the lookout for things like cherry picking.
Right.
This is when someone selects only the information that supports their argument while ignoring any information that contradicts it.
Right.
Or false dichotomies.
Right.
This is when someone presents two options as the only possibilities, when in reality there may be other options available. Or ad hominem attacks.
Yeah.
This is when someone attacks the person making the argument rather than addressing the argument itself.
Oh, right.
Or emotional appeals. This is when someone uses emotions such as fear, anger, patriotism to try to persuade people to agree with them.
Right. Being aware of these tactics can help us to be more discerning consumers of information and to make more informed decisions about who and what to believe.
So you're saying that in this age of information overload, it's more important than ever to be media literate?
Absolutely. Media literacy is no longer just a nice-to-have skill. It's an essential skill for navigating the 21st century. And it's a skill that we can all develop with a little bit of effort.
Yeah, it's about being proactive,
Yeah.
being curious,
Yeah.
and being willing to think critically about the information that we're consuming.
And it's about recognizing that the media we consume, it doesn't just inform us, it also shapes our understanding of the world, our values, our beliefs.
Right. So let's choose our media wisely.
Yes.
And let's use those critical thinking skills to separate fact from fiction, truth from lies, and reality from spin.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another important aspect of this election, voter turnout. Because it doesn't matter how informed we are, how much research we do, or how passionate we are about the issues if we don't actually show up and vote.
That's right. Our democracy only works if we participate in it. And one of the most fundamental ways to participate is by voting.
And yet voter turnout in this country is often abysmally low, especially compared to other developed democracies.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there are a number of factors at play. Some people are disillusioned with the political process, feeling like their vote doesn't matter, or that the system is rigged against them. Others are facing barriers to voting, such as restrictive voter ID laws, long lines at the polls, or difficulty getting time off work to vote. And still, others are simply not engaged in the political process, feeling like they don't have the time, the energy, or the knowledge to participate.
Yeah, but the reality is our votes do matter.
They do.
They're the most powerful tool we have for shaping our democracy and holding our leaders accountable.
So how do we increase voter turnout? Well, there are a number of things we can do. We can start by making it easier for people to vote, by implementing things like automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, and early voting. We can also make Election Day a national holiday so that everyone has the opportunity to vote without having to take time off work. And we can work to educate people about the importance of voting, the issues at stake, and the power they have to make a difference.
Because when more people vote, our democracy is stronger. So let's all make a commitment to vote in this election. And let's encourage our friends, family members, and neighbors to do the same.
Because our voices matter. Our votes count. And together, we can make a difference.
Now let's talk about what happens after the election. Because regardless of who wins, our work as engaged citizens is far from over.
That's right. It's important to remember that elections are not the end of the story. They're just the beginning of a new chapter.
Yeah. And our role as engaged citizens is to continue to hold our elected officials accountable, to demand transparency and integrity, and to ensure that their actions reflect the will of the people.
And it's about staying engaged, staying informed, and continuing to learn and grow as citizens.
Because our democracy depends on it. So as we head into this final week and beyond, let's remember the lessons we've learned from this deep dive. Let's be critical thinkers, discerning consumers of information, and active participants in shaping the future we want to see.
Let's resist those forces of division and manipulation, and instead embrace empathy, dialogue, and a shared commitment to the common good. Because that's how we build a better tomorrow, together.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the drama of election season. The debates, the attack ads, the constant barrage of information. It can feel like a whirlwind. But at the end of the day, what matters most is what happens after the votes are counted.
Exactly. The real work begins when the campaign slogans fade away and the elected officials have to actually govern.
And that's where we come in, right?
Right.
We, the voters, have a responsibility to hold those elected officials accountable, to make sure they're following through on their promises, representing our interests.
It's about staying engaged, staying informed, and continuing to participate in the political process even after the election is over.
Yeah, because our democracy doesn't just function on election day.
Right.
It functions every day.
Yeah.
And it requires our active and ongoing participation to thrive.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the pre-election landscape, I want to leave you with a few thoughts to ponder as you head to the polls and beyond. First, remember that your vote is powerful. It's your voice in our democracy. And it's a right that many people around the world fight and even die for, so don't take it for granted.
It's easy to feel like one vote doesn't make a difference, especially in a country as large as ours. But when we all participate, when we all make our voices heard, it sends a powerful message to those in power.
Exactly. And it's not just about voting for president. It's about voting in every election,
Right.
from local school board races to congressional elections, because every level of government affects our lives in some way.
And remember, even if your candidate doesn't win, your participation still matters. It helps to shape the political landscape, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that our democracy remains vibrant and responsive to the needs of the people.
Now, here's another thought to chew on. Be wary of those who seek to divide us. In a time when political polarization is running rampant, it's easy to fall into the trap of us versus them thinking.
We see it all the time, don't we?
Never do.
On social media, in the news, even in our own personal conversations. It's like we're constantly being bombarded with messages that tell us to fear and distrust anyone who doesn't share our exact views.
And that's a dangerous path to go down.
Yeah.
Because it erodes our sense of community, undermines our ability to solve problems together, and makes it easier for those in power to manipulate us.
So how do we resist those divisive forces?
I think it starts with recognizing our shared humanity, with remembering that even those who disagree with us on political issues are still our fellow human beings. They have their own hopes, dreams, and struggles, just like we do.
And it's about being willing to listen to those who hold different perspectives, to try to understand where they're coming from, and to find common ground where we can. It's not about giving up our own beliefs or values, but it is about recognizing that there are multiple ways of looking at the world,
Absolutely.
and that none of us have a monopoly on the truth.
That's such an important reminder because it's so easy to get caught up in our own echo chambers, surrounded by people who agree with us, who reinforce our existing beliefs. But that doesn't actually help us to grow or to learn or to become more informed citizens.
Exactly. So challenge yourself to step outside of your comfort zone.
Right.
Talk to people who hold different views than your own. Read news from a variety of sources, and be open to the possibility that you might learn something new, even if it challenges your existing beliefs.
Is right.
Okay, one last thought for our listeners to ponder as they head into the voting booth. Remember that this is not just about choosing a president. It's about choosing the kind of future we want to create for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren.
It's about deciding what kind of country we want to live in, what values we want to uphold, and what kind of legacy we want to leave behind. So take your vote seriously, do your research, think critically, and cast a vote that reflects your hopes for a better tomorrow.
Because the future is in our hands.
Well said. This has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to guide us through this pre-election landscape and for sharing your wisdom with our listeners.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations, and I hope they encourage people to think more deeply about the issues and to engage more actively in our democracy. That's what we're all about here at the Deep Dive.
Absolutely.
We want to empower our listeners to be informed, engaged, and thoughtful citizens.
Because at the end of the day, that's what makes our democracy strong.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dives into the political landscape 1 week before this pivotal election. It's been a fascinating journey, exploring the strategies, the anxieties, and the narratives that are shaping this crucial moment in our nation's history. But remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. The real work starts now. So stay engaged, stay informed, and let's make our voices heard.
And that's a dangerous path to go down because it erodes our sense of community, undermines our ability to solve problems together, and makes it easier for those in power to manipulate us.
Yeah, so how do we resist those divisive forces?
I think it starts with recognizing our shared humanity, with remembering that even those who disagree with us on political issues are still our fellow human beings. They have their own hopes, dreams, and struggles, just like we do.
And it's about being willing to listen to those who hold different perspectives, to try to understand where they're coming from, and to find common ground where we can. It's not about giving up our own beliefs or values,
Right.
but it is about recognizing that there are multiple ways of looking at the world, and that none of us have a monopoly on the truth.
That's such an important reminder because it's so easy to get caught up in our own echo chambers, surrounded by people who agree with us, who reinforce our existing beliefs. But that doesn't actually help us to grow or to learn or to become more informed citizens.
Exactly. So challenge yourself to step outside of your comfort zone.
Right.
Talk to people who hold different views than your own. Read news from a variety of sources, and be open to the possibility that you might learn something new, even if it challenges your existing beliefs.
That's right.
Okay, one last thought for our listeners to ponder as they head into the voting booth. Remember that this is not just about choosing a president. It's about choosing the kind of future we want to create for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren.
It's about deciding what kind of country we want to live in, what values we want to uphold, and what kind of legacy we want to leave behind. So take your vote seriously, do your research, think critically, and cast a vote that reflects your hopes for a better tomorrow.
Because the future is in our hands.
Well said. This has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to guide us through this pre-election landscape and for sharing your wisdom with our listeners.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations, and I hope they encourage people to think more deeply about the issues and to engage more actively in our democracy.
Absolutely.
That's what we're all about here at The Deep Dive.
Absolutely.
We want to empower our listeners to be informed, engaged, and thoughtful citizens.
Because at the end of the day, that's what makes our democracy strong.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the political landscape 1 week before this pivotal election. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the strategies, the anxieties, and the narratives that are shaping this crucial moment in our nation's history. But remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. The real work starts now. So stay engaged, stay informed, and let's make our voices heard.